Okay, we'll get started on the afternoon panel. This panel is extremism, malware markets, and the public use of Tor. I'm the moderator, Brandon Valeriano from the Marine Corps University. And our first presentation will be James Hamilton from Virginia Tech, Online Extremism in the United States.
We're actually going in a different order.
I thought we just said that. Okay. Okay, so it's Andrew Linder, Skidmore. Interest in Tor and political events.
There? Yeah, great. Okay. All right, sorry about that.
So start over.
So what we're going to do here is we are going to use Google search and study the question ecologically by looking at the number of people searching on Google for Tor in a state year. So it's going to be New York, 2006, 2007, and so on. And look at what are the conditions in particular state years, and then what are what's the level of Tor interest in that place. Now you might be saying, well, just because people are searching for Tor, does that mean that it bears relation to actual Tor usage? And actually, this has been studied in a number of different studies to track things where we can count the real life thing. So we can compare Google search to some kind of outcome. So there's some evidence that Google search is a good indicator of local interest of various things. Now, one thing to be really careful of here as we interpret results is that this morning when Gareth was giving numbers about users, those are actual Tor users. There's a big difference between someone searching what is Tor and someone being like a hardcore daily user of Tor. And so this gives us a sense of interest in Tor in a place, but not necessarily of hardcore usage or even light usage. So that's something we want to be careful with. All right, so some things we should expect in this study. One of the stories I said was that people are pushed to Tor by surveillance. If that's the case, we would expect that in state years where there were more searches for Edward Snowden after his revelations of mass surveillance, where people are searching for more on Edward Snowden, they're interested in that topic, we would see more interest in Tor. Likewise, if it was more the pull effect, they're drawn by the lure of the dark web, we would expect that in places where there are more searches for dark web, deep web, Silk Road, for there to be higher levels of Tor. We have several controls in this study. One has to do with politics. Now, politically, the political right, has had anti-government sentiment and not wanted the government spying. The political left tends to defend civil liberties. In this study, we have two measures of political attitudes in a state. One is a citizen ideology measure from left to right, and it measures the electorate's attitudes in that state year, how liberal or conservative they are. The other is a political measure of the state legislators, how conservative or liberal they are. And, you know, it's a little bit hard to tell because maybe more liberal places would have some reason to be more opposed to surveillance. Maybe conservative places would be. Overall, though, because the left has been more outspoken on surveillance issues, I went into this thinking that more liberal places would tend to have greater interest in Tor. We also thought that several different demographic factors would matter. Specifically, we thought that, you know, Tor would be, I was picturing San Francisco when I started this study. Like, that's where Tor would be big. It would be like kind of populous, highly educated, disproportionately white areas. And so we control for a number of demographic conditions of the state years. We also, Tor, if you go to a Tor project place, they tell you that journalists, tech industry people, and people in activists are using Tor. And so we thought, okay, maybe labor representation in those state years would also affect it. So we control for the percent of journalists, the percent of tech workers, and because of a multicollinearity issue, the number of legislators. So as an indicator of the size of the political sector in that state. So we expect for TOR to be higher in those places because that's what the TOR project says, places with more representation of those industries. So to go about doing this, we got, data from a few sources. One source is Google Trends. There we took the dependent variable, TOR, as well as measures of how much interest there was in Edward Snowden, how much interest there was in dark web, deep web, Silk Road. From the American Community Survey, which is a census-run survey, the best source of community-level data, we took our demographic measures. We were able to get the political measures from IPPSR, and then got the labor measures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In doing this analysis, we put this all in a multi-level model and run fixed effects models. I'm not going to show you that. Instead, I'm going to try to visualize this for you in a few ways. A few things. One, during this time period, TOR interest goes up. This is the distribution of variation over time of interest in TOR by state. Here's Virginia and DC. Virginia is kind of middle of the pack for TOR interest. DC is at the very low end. And you can see there are some states with a lot of variation, states with less variation by year. Here's what it looks like for the country as a whole over time. So we can see it growing all over a country. 2014 is the peak year. Now on to the big hypotheses. Surprisingly not correlated with TOR at the state year level were most of the demographics and any of the measures of labor representation. To give you one visualization of what that looks like, here is TOR interest by median household income. If I were fitting a line through that, it would be a flat line. And so there's just no association whatsoever, and this holds for most of those measures. It's definitely not a red state, blue state thing. Hunting is popular in the red states as a search. Mad Men is popular in the blue states as a search. Here's what TOR looks like. It has some red states, some blue states, and in our model, none of the political measures were statistically significant. What was significant was at the 0.1 level, although this is a population of state years, was the dark web. And what we can see is that for all but 2015, there's a significant association between interest in the dark web and TOR volume. Now, you can see the values are pretty clustered, rather lowly, very tightly in the early years, the first row. That's because there's just low levels of search for everything. We could change that axis and it would widen out. But still, there is a pretty steep slope, a strong relationship between the two. So that's the pull. On the push side of things, here's the correlation between searches for Snowden and TOR. And what we can see is, especially in 2013, the year the news came out, there's a pretty strong relationship. This is the predicted value in the regression model. So key findings, like I said, interest in TOR has grown over time. It tends to be in states with slightly smaller than average populations. For every 10% increase of the interest in Edward Snowden, we found a 7.7% increase in TOR, giving some evidence for the push. We also found for every 10% increase in dark web searches, there's a 7% increase in TOR searches, giving some evidence for the story of the pull. Finally, TOR, much to my surprise, does not appear to be associated with either labor conditions or demographics of the area. Now, what this might suggest is that inequalities in TOR use, those demographics that were non-significant, that the differences are more within states them between states, so we can't observe it here. But Tor is not a culture wars issue like saying Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays. It's not a left-right sort of a thing. It's also not particularly associated with industries, as the Tor project suggests. Of the two, the push and the pull, we find that the Snowden revelations is a better predictor of Tor overall than deep web interest. But both of them are fairly strongly associated. Thanks very much for listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you. We have a few minutes for questions. I see one right there. Very quick.
Yeah.
How you doing, sir? So this seems to be sort of an introspective, like U.S. Perspective only. Did you happen to do some of the research globally with, like, so for example, like the Arab Spring? So Arab Spring kicking off, do we see any sort of influx of dark web usage or the Tor usage?
Right. So I actually think Eric could answer that better than I could because his study was cross-national. Mine was just within the U.S.
And the unfortunate thing is mine started right after that, so I don't have the data that would be needed in order to say here's the effect of the Arab Spring. In general, you do see substitution when there's major political events towards these sorts of technologies in terms of user data, but it tends to spike and then decline a fair bit. So not necessarily the best sort of cross-national answer, because I don't think we've been able to look at that yet.
Hi. So when looking at the Snowden as a predictor for dark web interest, it's interesting. Wouldn't those? I feel like people who are interested in Edward Snowden are likely to be interested in the dark web and are likely to be interested in Tor in general, right? I feel like there's a high correlation between those groups of people. So it's fair to say, are you saying that there's just a relationship between the two, or are you saying that one causes the other?
Right. So this is a great point because what I show you is Deep Web by Tor and Snowden by Tor, but I'm not showing you Deep Web by Snowden. And you're correct in your intuition that, yes, in fact, places that are interested in the dark web or deep web are also unusually interested in Edward Snowden. You can't see it with these scatter plots, but in the larger model we run, it tries to control. So what it attempts to do is say, taking two places where interest in the deep web is high, does the one with more interest in Edward Snowden then have more interest in Tor, while simultaneously doing the other one? By doing that kind of controlling, we attempt to disentangle it, but ultimately it is true that places that are interested in one also tend to be places interested in the other.
So on the slide where you had the chart showing all of the different states ranked,
Yeah.
At a quick glance, it looked to me like the ones at the top of the chart were states that are much more rural than others. Were you able to take the data down to more of a smaller location level, right, so that you could see, does that hold true even in states that have big cities?
Great question. So two answers to that. The first answer is that we do control for population and population density. So we control for basically how rural or how urbanized the state is. And if it was the case that it was principally rural states where the interest was high, we would expect to observe a statistically significant population density variable. We don't. So net of other things, it's probably not more rural areas. Now, it might be that that variation is hidden in states that average out to modest population density, but have both rural and urban places, and the actions all happening in the rural places. One way I'm getting at that is in the next study that I'm not presenting here today, but we're working on. We're doing the same exact thing, but for metro areas, so that we're comparing apples to apples there with only urban places. there, what you do see, it does tend to be slightly more liberal places. But again, how urbanized the places doesn't appear to have much of an effect.
Isn't this the sort of study that's really suitable for MTurk? The problem with MTurk is a selection effect, but there you can really isolate these types of users and dive in deeper there.
So to go on MTurk and say, answer these questions if you're, that would be interesting, and you could probably get some sample of people. I'd be worried about the representativeness of that, and I'd also be worried about, like, maybe people in MTurk would be comfortable saying, yeah, I'm buying drugs, but would they admit child abuse? You still have big social desirability barriers, even if it's completely confidential. Yeah.
So the conclusion that you laid out about sort of the relative unimportance of political factors, sort of saying this is not a left-right issue, I think it makes a certain amount of sense, and certainly the results seem to bear that out. Have you looked for the possibility that it's a far left, far right issue, in the sense that, if I live in the cabin in the woods in Montana, I might care a lot about Tor and the dark web. If I'm super far left and I think the government's out to get me, I might again care about this, and that it may be sort of a curvilinear type of relationship rather than a linear one.
Yeah, so in some versions of the model, I did put in a squared coefficient on the citizen ideology, and that it was not significant. So that suggests that in terms of like the overall average of the state, it's not curvilinear. What could be, and Jim and I were talking about this yesterday, you can have a very small number of people in a state who profoundly affect the overall political environment. And so one thing I'm thinking about that I haven't done yet would be to look at searches for nationalist movements or sovereign movements that represent some kinds of the far extremes that are like so small you wouldn't capture it in a statewide measure, but that could capture it with the Google search volume.
And those people also wouldn't participate in surveys that would measure right? I mean, they're not going to participate in any survey.
There's a long simmering feud between nationalists and sociologists,
Yes,
and
absolutely.
we can't get them to answer surveys.
You're not going to get them to participate.
Yeah.
Okay, well, any last questions? Okay, well, thank you. Now, you next? Okay, next we have Jim Howden from Virginia Tech, Online Extremism in the United States.
I'm going to use... I am. I'm just going to use an updated...
Yeah, that's fine. Do you think you'll use the, because now you can't, but
What's that?
you can't use the cooker anymore, but
Oh, okay. That's fine.
really want to be sure there's no malware on my computer in case.
There we go. Well, everyone, thank you for coming. I'm going to be talking about something kind of different than what we've been talking about most of the day. First of all, most of the activity that I'm going to be talking about is on the ClearNet, not on the dark web. I hope to tie that back into it. Secondly, we talked a lot about selling commodities on the dark web.
Could you put on the microphone?
I don't have it. Patrick stole mine. The other thing I'm talking about is, oh, here we go. Sorry. It's on. It is on. Very good. Okay, so one thing is I'll be talking more about the ClearNet than the dark web. Secondly, I'll be talking about the selling of ideas rather than the selling of commodities. And specifically, the ideas I'm talking about are those of online extremism. And so this is based off work that I started in 2013 with some colleagues from Finland and Germany, and we looked at extremism in the US, Germany, Finland, the UK. Then extended this with funding from the National Institute of Justice. And really what we've been looking at is exposure to extremism, the consequences of that exposure, and what the rhetoric of that exposure, and then who, at least to some extent, admits to being involved in extremism. And by extremism, we use the European Union's definition, and so it's attacks on people because of their membership in a group. So it's attacks on or degrading of people because of their race, their ethnicity, their nationality, their gender, their sexual orientation, political views, religious views. Basically, the difference between it and cyberbullying is I can hate you for you. I could say, you know, I hate you because you're stupid, because you're ugly, you know, whatever. That's bullying. But if I hate you because of your innate status, because you're a man, because you are liberal, because you are Christian, then that's extremism. And so what we've done is we tried to track exposure to extremism. And what we see is that over time, there has been a relatively precipitous increase. In 2013, well, there was about 53% of respondents said that they had seen attacks of groups within the last 3 months. By 2018, you see it's almost 74%, almost 3/4 of people. You see a little spike in 2016 based on some open-ended questions. This was undoubtedly related to the election, but it went down in 2017, but now up again. So if we look since 2013, there's been over a 30% increase in exposure. And indeed, this has become more vile. While the use of stereotypes is maybe unpleasant, we see that more serious types of exposure is happening. Now, 24% of the people who said that they've seen this said that what they saw advocated violence against the group. This is up by almost 13%. We see that they're blaming the group for their personal problems, up by almost 30%. Blaming the group for the country's problem, up by over 30%. Advocating hatred for the group, up by 19%. And calls for discriminating against the group, up by about 23%. Now, if you look at all of these aspects of what the extremism is calling for, these are all behaviors that precipitate pretty ugly events in history. When we start out, you know, blaming groups for the country's problems, stereotyping about the group, this is all aspects of othering that have preceded a number of unpleasant events. And now, we've always had extremism, that's to be sure. But I would argue that the internet has radically changed the nature of what is required for any social movement to succeed, and especially the social movements of extremism. If we think traditionally what source mobilization theory and other social movement theories point to that are required for a social movement to be successful, you need money, you need a good organization, you need to frame your strategies, you need to market your message, you need good leadership, and you need some true believers, some willing participants. Well, I would argue that the internet has radically changed all this. The internet's virtually free. You don't need much money to be on the internet. You really don't need an organization. You really don't need a leader. And if you don't have a leader, you really need one person to follow you. Really what it's all about is the message. It's about framing the idea and how to market this. And so what we look at the way that these groups market their ideas, they do so on the ClearNet differently than they do on the dark web. When we look on the ClearNet, it's about educating you. Really, we don't hate anybody, you just don't understand the real problem. When you look on the dark web, they'll tell you what the real problem is, and that's that you should hate these people. But what we see, and I'm sure this isn't news to anybody in the room, but these hate groups and extremists operate on the dark web. They use things like Tor. And indeed, in our analysis, people who have used Tor, independent of other factors, are 38% more likely to have seen this material. And they're about 85% more likely to have produced this material. So that's where a lot of this is happening and these discussions are happening. But then, of course, what happens is that they send their ideas into the ClearNet. And looking at recent research, actually saw this as a job talk at Virginia Tech, the gentleman was tracing information coming from the dark web and how it spread on Twitter. And what he found was that alternative news, or some would call fake news, spreads much more quickly on Twitter than does real news stories from reliable sources, mainstream sources. Of course, we all know none of them are reliable. We also see that those stories that are from alternative sources, it comprises about 5% of tweets. And when you think about the volume of tweets, that's a fair number of them are coming from the dark web. Now, of course, once they get out into the ClearNet, they go through all kind of networks and shared by millions of people. And as this happens, this exposure goes up. What we know is that exposure is one of the first steps on the pathways to radicalization. And eventually, you're going to run into a network that's sharing this idea, if it's framed properly, that is going to attract or recruit back into the group and into the dark web. And indeed, we see once you're exposed, your probability of taking that second step on the path of radicalization, that is starting to produce these messages, start to increase. And as we see over time, not only has exposure increased, but so has the number of people who admit to producing materials that they say others would likely define as hate materials. This is up by over 150% since 2013. So really what we see is more of this is happening. And I want to think about as really kind of policies, what can we do about this? If we think about social control in general, there's 3 ways we can control behavior, 3 spheres of control. There is the private sphere, friends and family. There is the parochial sphere, and in the offline world, we talk about the networks of interlocking institutions, your churches, your religious institutions, social clubs, schools, these types of things that make up a community. And then there's the public sphere, the bureaucratic agencies of the state. Well, of course, the problem here is, bummer. The problem here is that we are talking about ideas being marketed. Most of these groups are not dumb enough, at least on the ClearNet, to start, I'll leave it there. Most of them are not dumb enough to openly advocate violence to the point where they are violating our hate speech laws, because we have no hate speech laws. The level of the legal bar in this country for violating the First Amendment is set very high. We put a primacy on free speech. So there's not much the state can do here in terms of legal action. Of course, what we can do falls on the parochial realm. Places like, you will hear people say, like, well, it's a matter of free speech. And indeed, in our country, the government can infringe upon your free speech. But Twitter is not the government. Facebook is not the government. They can put up and take down whatever they want. So it is conceivable that they could block some of this. And indeed, there is a move to do this, especially in Europe. Germany, for example, has passed laws where they now will fine and I guess they're going after Facebook primarily. If there's a report of this type of material online, they have to take it down within 24 hours, or they will be face a serious fine. But I would argue that there are other things we can do. This is about ideas. And so what we need to do is, if we want to combat this, is to put out counter-narratives. They, of course, can flood the networks with their message. We have to flood the networks with our message if this is going to work. And I would argue that the other thing that we could think about doing is to reinstate in some way the fairness doctrine that required places to present 2 sides of an issue. On any controversial issue that was being presented, we were supposed to give both sides of it were supposed to get equal time. This, of course, there are problems with this, and it was, we got rid of it in 1987, formally got rid of it more recently, but the issues of extremism, extremes come because of polarization, and I would say polarization comes because of lack of dialogue. So I think what we need to try to do is to foster that dialogue. And one way of doing that is to have reasonably reliable sources where you get both sides of the issue, not just one. You don't have to flip back and forth from MSNBC to Fox to hear both sides of the issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Questions? Rachel over there?
Ooh, hello. Okay, great. So I have 2 questions for you. Thank you so much for your presentation. I especially really interested in slide 5 there. But first question is, what % of the volume increase in extremist messaging do you think is a result of Russian influence operations in the US? And secondly, do you find evidence of that participation in those dark web circles of trust?
Okay, so the answer to the second one's easy. I don't know. You're saying, no, we have not really, we can't really speak to that with the data that we have. And I cannot really say for sure to answer your first question, but I do think some of that increase in 2016 was indeed due to Russian bots. I think that, of course, what they were trying to do is to polarize. And so a lot of the messages that were being sent out were on the extreme left and right. And of course, once that message is out there, then extremists would pick it up and retweet. And the number of retweets on those are just incredibly high, right? That a friend of mine always says, if you read something and you're like, really? It's probably fake news, right? But I think that, yes, I think a lot of it in 2016 was that. Whether or not that's still going on, I don't know.
Eric?
Thank you, Jim. Very, very interesting. I have 2 questions as well. One is that in your data, with the increase that you're seeing in people admitting to producing what could be classified as sort of extremist content, depending on how much you sort of shaped their definition of this is what extremist content means. So if you did your introductory preamble there where it's like it's about targeting a group, talking about a group, I was wondering if your data allowed you to sort of disentangle those who are admitting that they're engaging in the production of what could be classified as extremist content because they're producing a counter-narrative. So I'm not on Facebook, but I am on Twitter, and I notice all the time on Twitter that one message comes out and then there's a whole bunch of people who climb on basically actively countering the narrative, but they're still producing what could be classified according to the definition as extremist content. And that would be different than those who are sort of organically originating extremist content, which is a slightly different, one's certainly more problematic, I think, than the other. So that's my first sort of query. And secondly, with the reinstitution of the fairness principle, I'd be interested in your thoughts, sort of speculating on the viability of such a thing, or who would be doing such an implementation in an ecosystem where you have sort of decentralized production of content. That with media outlets, it was relatively simple. You had to, as a centralized source, say this is this side of the story and then this is this side of the story. Whereas if you have an individual or a series of individuals producing content, I think Facebook's actually speculated about, pushing to people's feeds counter-narrative stories, but would it all effectively fall on the content platforms?
Okay, so your second question first. I think, yes, with broadcast news, it's relatively easy to enforce as we get into more decentralized news sources, although there's a debate about how decentralized our news is. But yes, it would largely have to fall on these platforms, and the ability to enforce that, of course, would be marginally effective at best, I would think. I think it would be an ideal to shoot for, and we can pressure these platforms as public utilities to behave more in the line of what we would like them to see them behave. In terms of your first question, I think that, well, first of all, we do run we run a survey experiment where we provide them with a definition of extremism, and then randomly assigned, some don't get it, and we have found no difference in any of the meaningful variables that we've looked at. But in terms of, we ask people what they do when they see this type of material, and roughly about a third of them say that they routinely defend the person being, or the group being attacked, and which is what you were talking about. But I don't know how they defend them. We don't have those data. But I would think that a lot of that is also hate speech, right? Like, so you're defending somebody by calling them a racist, right? And now, if you're just calling that individual racist, I wouldn't say that's extremism. But if you're saying, well, you're a middle-aged white guy, you're a racist, right? That is. So, I know, exactly. So I do think there is some of that. We cannot disaggregate. I think there has been a change in levels of civility over the last couple of years. And how much of that 151% increase is an actual increase in the behavior versus no longer being afraid to say, yeah, I talk smack on groups. We do not know.
So the young lady in the back, and then Andrew.
So to go back to your recommendation that we institute a fairness doctrine of some sort. So I would love it if Facebook or Twitter would be required to give both sides of an issue from a reputable source. That would be great. The thing is that it sounds really similar to quote unquote fact checking, right? It's in the same line of reasoning. And we know that fact checking, unless it's from a person from your in-group, right? It doesn't really work that well. I would love it if we did it. I think we should. We should do everything we can to stop this, but it doesn't work as well. What about requiring for people to be educated about these news sources, which I think is an even harder thing to ask for, but in general, like, you can't stop people from seeing fake news once they see it, or like extreme news, but you can teach them to identify it.
Yes, and I think, I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of if I believe you and you say it's fake news, I'm going to believe it's fake news. If I don't believe you, I'm going to say, well, no, you're fake news, right? And absolutely. But the trick is to get people before they are in their tribe, right? And I think the way to do that is to have these nuanced, more nuanced understanding of issues in the larger discussion. I think that we have increasingly pushed it to where you're just talking to your, right, the whatever you want to call it, the filter bubble or the echo chamber or whatever you want to call it that happens in online communities. If these conversations were in the broader community, I think we might get fewer people going to the extreme. We would still get the extremes, and once that happens, I'm going to believe what I want to believe. You're absolutely right. Teaching people how to, like, think. Well, right. Well, just teaching people how to critically evaluate information is critical, right? But good luck with that. That's the next panel, isn't it?
It's rhetorically palatable to talk about extremism being on both sides. Mm-hmm. But in fact, we know that there's extreme asymmetry. You know, Bernie bros might be bullies, but they're not gearing up with AKs and walking around with torches.
Right. Right.
And so I wonder if you could say a word about the asymmetry, and in particular, how that asymmetry poses problems for platforms like Facebook in terms of implementing solutions.
Yeah, okay, so the asymmetry right now, the web, really since about 2008, Extremism, domestic extremism, is completely dominated by the right. But we shouldn't forget the fact that in the 70s, it was completely dominated by the left, and in fact, acts of terrorism are down tremendously since the 70s. The right-wing terrorist groups, the extremists that are active today cannot compete with what was happening in the late 60s and 70s in terms of number of incidents, number of killed, right? But you're absolutely right now, I guess it's always asymmetrical. Which group is dominating right now is the right. And I think in terms of what this means for Facebook and how to combat it, it's difficult in terms of combating precisely because, like what we were talking about with your paper, if you're a sovereign nation type of group, and what Grace was just saying, of course I'm not going to believe this if it's coming from the state, if it's coming from any kind of authority, it's all fake news, right? And just quickly dismiss it. So again, I think what we have to try to do is to target the middle, that what we have seen just politically, just as on a general political scale, we have moved the center so far to the right in our country that extreme right doesn't necessarily seem that extreme anymore, right? When you compare where we were politically 50 years ago, the center has moved. I think what we need to do is to complicate that center. What does it mean to be moderate in 21st century U.S.?
And the last question to Aaron.
I would ask a little bit about the algorithmic basis for extremism. And you can test this out right now. If you go to YouTube and you type in a moderate right-wing video, your next video displayed will be a slightly more right or left, depending on which way you go. And so how do we get beyond the profit-seeking incentive of platforms to foster content lock-in so that they keep your attention span longer and longer with their platforms so they can make money?
Right.
So that, so you can shift people subconsciously away from that by beginning to filter them the other direction. You have to do it very slowly, but it's much easier to shift them
to the way they want to go.
once they're on the extreme.
Right.
So how do we get around
this? That's your job. No, I think, I mean, that could be one way to pressure these providers such as Facebook in terms of some kind of, if you're going to do this algorithmic push, then it can't be political, or if it's going to be political content that you're pushing, that you have to kind of randomly select from news sources, right? That which one's going to be sent out next, and but I don't know.
Right now, they feed them in so they make more money.
Of course, right, and I think it's one thing to feed in your consumer preference for brown shoes, right, over black shoes. It's another thing to feed in your political preference for whatever political preference you're talking about. But yeah, I mean, without, I mean, one thing we could do, I mean, this would be quite radical, but we could declare things like Facebook a public utility. And if they're using the internet, it's a public utility. It's like a water company. We're going to regulate it more. I don't think that will ever go over, but,
Okay, thank you. And our next presenter will be Eric Nunez. Our next presenter will be Eric Nunez from Arizona State University, presenting on malware markets and the dark web.
So that mouse power really, really sucks.
Oh, that mouse, okay.
This is your clicker. There's your, turn that on as your mic. There you go. Have fun.
So can everyone hear me? Yeah. Is this fine? Okay, so we had quite good interesting talks like since this morning talking about Tor services and the dark web in general. We had talks regarding cryptocurrencies and drug marketplaces and how cryptocurrencies are used and what kind of even like Ponzi schemes that are run using these cryptocurrencies. So what I do in the group that I work at Arizona State is we actually look at these markets as well as forums, and we basically focus on the malicious aspect of it in terms of security and hacking perspectives. So we try to look at markets and see like what kind of exploits or any services that are being offered which will actually target systems, target organizations, target critical infrastructure, as well as look at discussions in these forums that might indicate what are the current cyber events that are going on, what possible current future events could occur, and what are the systems or infrastructure that are of more interest to threat actors, and maybe look at them and see like if there is an actual threat. So the first stage is always like we want to collect like as much data as possible from these dark web forums and marketplaces. So we had an infrastructure in place, which is actually the way it works is, just to give you a quick overview, is we have a security analyst who can actually speak multiple languages, and they actually go into these Tor websites, and they use some tools like scanning tools as well as some search engines to actually look through and find, based on keywords, some of the forums and marketplaces. At first, they actually go in themselves, look manually at some of the content, and based on the content, they actually decide whether this is of interest in respect to malicious hacking or not. Once they decide it is, then it actually goes in a queue where a crawler actually goes in and basically crawls everything it can basically grab from that website. And one of the key things that even Nicholas brought up was like there are always like security measures from administrators themselves. Like they have CAPTCHAs, and they have sometimes it's very difficult. Some forums are only invite only. So like you have to show some kind of skill level in order to get into these forums, or contribute something in order to get into these forums. So we have security analysts who actually try to overcome all these barriers and actually get credentials like usernames and passwords. And then the crawler takes it from there, basically grabs everything. One thing that initially we observed was, initially we just ran the crawler. It went in, it tried to grab as many pages as possible, and in a couple of minutes was kicked out. So that happened over and over again in a lot of these forums and markets. So what we thought was maybe the crawler should not just go in and kind of behave like a computer, but try to behave as someone who's trying to browse this website. Maybe go from topic to topic rather than going radically towards all the topics and trying to grab everything. So we actually implemented a topic modeling model which actually goes in, and whether if it's looking for something very specific, it tries to only first grab those pages which belong to that particular topic and then shift it from there. So it looks like more like a person who's trying to look at a particular topic. And we also introduce different variations in how much time it takes to grab each page, include some of the randomness in there to make it as probabilistic as possible. So the crawler goes in, grabs everything, and then the parser actually extracts all the information. In the forums, it extracts the topic, the users posting in that topic, what kind of interaction is going on, what is the content of these interactions, if there are any software tags or any kind of organizations, systems that are mentioned in these discussions, and so on. And from the markets is basically tries to grab from descriptions what is being sold, if there is any rating, what kind of feedback. So basically all that information it can find, and it stores in a database. From this database we can actually do a lot of things. We can look at different price variations for different products. From the forums we can actually bring social networks of which users interact more with which users have a higher there is a rating system. So some of the users are more trusted than the others. Their answers actually get a lot of upvotes, and most of the users are actually waiting for them to answer in some of those services. So we find a lot of these cool things. And the one thing that we try to do is we try to look at it from different perspectives. We try to look at it from the system perspective, where we are trying to find vulnerabilities, disclosures, look at exploits available, if those exploits are publicly available or if they are not, if those systems are already patched or they are not, and try to see like what kind of measures we can take. We also try to look at what kind of users are actually posting these discussions, what is the history of those users way back when the forum started, what have we been posting, whom they have been interacting, and so on. And one more thing that we do is we try to match users across different platforms, across different forums and marketplaces. One thing that we have observed is because trust is a very important factor in these forums, a lot of these people kind of end up using the same usernames across forums, because some forums are invite only. So if you have a good reputation in one of the forums, it gets carried on to different forums, and so they actually maintain the same username. So it becomes easy to track down what are the interests of these actors and basically go out from there. So just to give you a quick overview of the malicious markets. So the dynamics of these markets are basically, we try to focus on marketplaces that sell malware exploits. We try to monitor these actors, and we try to examine products from the social structures. For example, a lot of these people who are trying to ask for services are newbies, and a lot of these people who are providing services and exploits are basically experts. So there is like a pyramid structure inside all these forums and marketplaces, where there are a lot of amateurs at the bottom, a lot of people who can basically run a couple of commands and maybe use tools which are available directly, and then as you go down it becomes much narrow towards who the actual experts are, who can actually write their own exploits, maybe discover 0 days in different systems and can provide them. So some of the examples that we have is, so we have like places where botnets scripts are being sold, and we also have places where actual 0-day exploits belonging to Microsoft Office, as well as some of the Android 0-day exploits that are being sold. One thing that we observe is 0-day exploits definitely have more price than any of those standard exploits that we encounter, and these exploits remain at a high price till so these exploits actually, so they start off with at a very high price. They remain at a high price even when a patch is released. Like if this becomes public disclosure what the vulnerability is, and even a patch is released, they still remain at a high price up to 2 to 3 months. Now why 2 to 3 months is because there is a research that shows that even up to 2 to 3 months, a majority of systems will never patch. You take the patch and basically fix their systems. They'll still be exposed. But after 2 to 3 months, this price actually starts to decrease, and after a while, they almost become like they are giving it out for free for newbies to just try it out, because most of the systems are already patched and they won't actually do anything on those systems. So the actual what we can do is we can actually look at these communities of vendors and see like what kind of things that they are more interested in. what kind of systems they actually prefer targeting. There are vendors who will only post about Microsoft related things, operating systems, as well as applications running on these Microsoft systems. So we can actually see like what kind of systems have been targeted. Based on the exploit and 0-day, we would know like what kind of certain vulnerability that can be exploited in the wild. Now, why I would say that these kind of vulnerabilities are more important than the ones that are mentioned in, for example, so NIST actually maintains a database of all the vulnerabilities out there. If you look at NIST vulnerabilities, only I think 2.5 to 3% of those vulnerabilities are ever exploited every year. So what it says, and if you look at it, more than 50% of those vulnerabilities have a rating which is more than 9, which is out of 10. So which means that it is severe. So if an organization is looking at that kind of rating and basically deciding, okay, so we have to patch like maybe 50% of our vulnerabilities, so that actually focuses a lot of resources that the organization has in order of patching those. But only 2% will ever be exploited. So which ones need to be patched, more important. But the dark web is a different thing, because what we have observed through our research is, in the dark web, if a particular vulnerability is mentioned or discussed by a threat actor, the chances goes from 3 to 15% of being exploited in the coming weeks. So that actually helps in prioritizing what kind of vulnerability management system an organization might be running. So that helps. And for forums is much more interesting, because forums you actually have discussions and you have people interacting with each other. So that actually helps, like if someone is looking, if someone has identified some vulnerability but he's not sure how to actually exploit them, he can provide the details and an expert can actually comment on what changes need to be made or how an exploit needs to be structured in order to exploit that vulnerability. So the dynamics of the forums are basically, you have existing members, administrators, and moderators. You have a social network of most active users, and you have interactions between users. And you also have like different kinds. You can also look at these forums and you can also identify where the people are actually kind of located geographic wise, based on what time of the day they actually reply to most of the discussions. Because we have observed like sometimes in some forums, the questions are basically done, like some of the discussions happen only during daytime when it is in US, but the replies are always during nighttime when it is in US. So it's mostly coming towards from the side of Russia or Eastern Europe, where all the replies are coming from. And we also observe like some of these replies would be in their own languages as well. And so we also have observe a lot of language variety. The forums that we actually crawl, a majority of them are in English, but we do have quite a good distribution of different European languages that actually have some. So a forum is not like, some of these forums are specific for one particular language, but some of the forums have topics in all different languages. So people interact all the time. And most of these topic discussions that we have after filtering the data is hacking tools, trust, security, privacy, political events, censorship, surveillance, vulnerability disclosures. Someone found a vulnerability in a particular application and he just discloses it and lets everyone know how it can be exploited, so people can work on it. If someone comes up with the proof of concept or an exploit, he basically posts the link where everyone can download about it. And we also have discussions regarding potential systems that can be targeted. For example, in case of the WannaCry ransomware, which actually became public, I think on May 12th or somewhere around the second week of May. But before that, 3 weeks later, on a forum, it was actually posted by someone about 50 to 60,000 systems that belong to the medical domain that are actually vulnerable to this system, have been identified to be vulnerable to this exploit that we have. And 3 weeks later, those 50 to 60,000 systems were the first wave of the attack, and then the worm actually propagated throughout like over 150,000 systems in 50 countries. So we do have people who actually post these kind of discussions, but this is a good one. It's like a black swan event. So it happens like such precise details are very rare, but when they occur, so if we are able to identify those beforehand, we can actually take a look at it. And some of the topic examples, if you could see, are A lot of them actually also talk about carding services, where they actually have dumps of entire username passwords as well as credit cards from different companies. And these username passwords are important because some of them might think like, okay, for example, a particular organization got hacked. A lot of username passwords are out there. If that organization is not mine, then I should not worry about. But what happens is, a lot of times, the usernames that have been used on one site are often similar to the usernames that have been used on a lot of other sites by the same people. In some cases, even the password is the same. So these sites also become vulnerable. And even if the password doesn't work, even if you have the email address and details regarding a particular user, it results in phishing attacks, like spear phishing attacks, where people then, they try, based on the information they have, they try to send like emails to those users and basically try to get out passwords from there using fake sites. And not only are discussions, but there are market forum hybrids as well, where the forum actually acts as if a market itself are asking for services for hacking and providing tools for hacking. So forums is interesting, as I said, is we can actually look at the forum interactions and build social networks, as well as try to look at like what kind of vulnerability discussions are going on. Try to identify these vulnerabilities if they are exploited or not. If they are not, maybe look at what kind of discussions are going on and give it some kind of rating that says that this might be exploited in the future because of these reasons. And so it might help the vulnerability management system in a lot of these things. There are also discussions about credit structure, targeting power plants and different kinds of systems that are critical to a particular nation. So those kind of things are also there. And what we also gain an understanding is what are the motivations and what are the potential gains for an average hacker. So an hacker might be providing information freely because he just wants to just disclose everything in public. Sometimes he might ask for certain amount of payment for disclosing certain information. That we had interactions where a particular new product for a company, the architecture of that system was actually, the hacker claimed that he knew the exact architecture of that system, and he can actually provide the entire architecture, so you can actually reverse engineer it and do some kind of hacking in the system itself. But you would only offer it if certain amount was transferred through a Bitcoin, in terms of Bitcoin to him. So, and it also results in trust issues, like do you actually transfer these Bitcoins to him? So we actually can look at if he has a high reputation, then actually helps in order to transfer, because you trust him to provide that information. If he doesn't have that high reputation, then maybe it's just something, a scam or something. So these kind of things that we have had success identifying some of these factors in the forums as well as marketplaces, but a lot of these things can actually are still in the works, and we can actually look at it from a security perspective to actually help organizations or even nations in order to better defend their systems. I think that's it.
Great. Thank you. Questions? Eric?
Yeah. Thank you for that, Eric. It was very, very interesting and very informative. I have a couple of questions about whether you've sort of gone down in the data to sort of look at sort of co-associations, because one of the things that popped up to mind, one to do with language, one to do with you're using time of post to infer geography a little bit.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of systematic variation there about the sort of issues that people are discussing, about the degree of maybe even the severity of the vulnerabilities that they're discussing, or anything like this as it varies across language types or across geographic regions or anything of that sort?
So we did observe a lot of these mentions. So a lot of vulnerability mentions do come up in English forums, in English discussions, but if we correlate those to ones that have been exploited, the most success of having a particular vulnerability being exploited and mentioned comes in the Russian language and the Chinese language. So even though they mention less number of vulnerabilities, their exploitation rate is much higher than the English ones.
Do you have a sense of how much?
So I don't remember the exact numbers, but we do have a paper in which those numbers are mentioned. I can definitely share that with you. Yeah. And for the geographic thing, we only used that in terms of when we are not able to decide what kind of forum it is. So if it's completely hosted in a Russian language or a Chinese language, or if it's a mixture, then we try to look at the times in which we actually get replies. If there is any significance, like it's not that people in US cannot reply at night or post at night. So, but if more than like half of your discussions are always in a different time zone, then that actually raises like there are participants from different parts of the world.
Thank you. Right there in the middle.
Hey, you talked about the NIST CVE database
Yeah.
and said that 2% are roughly exploited.
Yeah.
And then you said that if you see them posted online, they have a significantly higher rate of exploitation. How do you arrive at those numbers?
So the 2% was actually based on a research. So we actually gathered the ground truth of exploitation from multiple sources. So Symantec actually maintains a signature database where all its sensors which are around the world, they actually record any kind of attack that has happened on their systems. And they also have, apart from Symantec, Rapid7 and some other companies also maintain this database. So we actually look at this and see like which CVs they detected. And based on that, we go from there.
Any other questions? Okay, we're about close to time anyway, so this will we'll wrap up the session.
All right. Yeah, thank you. And we have now a short break. There's fresh coffee, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, all of that over there. We're going to return then for the next session on sort of training the next generation of dark web analysts in about 10 minutes.
And you're live.
Okay.
You're live and ready?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
I can hear you.
Forward, backwards. Okay.
This is her name on the file. If you want to say one or two lines, totally up to you. Otherwise,
Hello? If everyone could please be seated. All right. I would like to introduce Professor Kathleen Moore of James Madison University. She is an expert in technology, intelligence analysis, and moreover, how to train students and new analysts in these disciplines. So this panel is called The Dark Web and Issues Teaching the New Analyst.
I will clarify. I will by no means claim to be an expert. A lot of people a lot smarter than me involved in this area as well. I'm very excited to talk to you about this today. Something happened about a month and a half ago that sparked an area of research for me. And it's three things that had occurred. One was we had our spring career fair at James Madison University, and I was having conversations with government agencies and various corporations. Two, an interesting conversation I had to have with some parents of a student. And then three, an experience I had taking students to IBM Cambridge where we participated in an incident response simulation. So it was the culmination of these three things happening all within 2 weeks of each other that, really got me started on this particular research I'm going to talk to you about today. Now, I'm right in the middle of it, so these are preliminary findings, but I think it can foster a really interesting discussion here. So, to start, what determines proficiency in dark web analysis? This is something I want you to think about just for now because we're going to come back to it at the end. And basically, I'm going to jump around a lot, but I promise I will bring it all back to center by the time we wrap up. So keep this in mind, and then hopefully we can have a good conversation about this when we're done. Okay, so when we talk about training students, and I say that, training, we're teaching them how to use tools and how to analyze a very specific environment. We talk about it in higher education, and it is extremely complicated. This is a very dynamic subject, and we have, 45 minutes here today? Yeah, I could probably go on for this for a couple hours. So to limit it down, when you talk about this, we have to talk about some systemic issues surrounding deep and dark web and understanding, kind of what plays into things that we're seeing today. So, first of all, glut of jobs in the job market. Second, obviously education. Talking about cybersecurity versus cyber intelligence. And then lastly, educational infrastructure. So, let's begin. I went back and I was had captured some information, I don't even know why I did it, from Indeed.com about available cybersecurity jobs. And I did this back in December. And in looking at this, it was really kind of interesting. I had grabbed the data, it was about 68,000 jobs, and you could look at it according to education, and you could see everything that was available. So you can see from high school to a doctoral degree, the number of jobs. Do we need to address something here? Pause. Do we know where it's coming from? Okay. All right, I'll continue then. So we can look, taking the jobs, I basically had categorized them according to education that was required, but then I also could go through and analyze them according to experience. And I'm like, okay, well, this is interesting. And I'd kind of sat on this data for a while. And then, of course, I told you a month and a half ago, I had all of these things happening all at once that made me revisit this. So first and foremost, When we talk about cybersecurity unemployment rate, it's 0%. It's absolutely 0%. Now, let's compare that. National unemployment rate, 3.9% and dropping. So obviously, what does this mean? We have a predicted 2 million jobs that will not be filled by 2019, which is going to equal additional pressure on the job market. That's an issue, yes? How many people have possibly a cybersecurity job open in their area? Yeah, how many, can you say? No, of course not.
I'm retired, but after 23 years in it.
Yeah, particularly?
And I retired 3 years ago, and at that time, not taking any thunder from you, but there was a shortage already of looking at needing to have about $200,000 cybersecurity.
Okay.
It's growing.
Yes, Gareth, I believe you mentioned something about that yesterday as well in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I mean, our students do a cybersecurity program, and I tell them when they start that they will get a job at the end as long as they are marginally competent.
Yeah, so, basically, yeah.
Even if they're not.
Yeah, many of them do, yeah.
Exactly. I can open up my email right now, and I will probably have about 10 inquiries saying, do you have any bodies for me? And this is a daily basis, anywhere from like probably about 10 to 15 inquiries. Do you have someone you can send to us? I don't know if anyone else is experiencing this, but this is a regular part of my experience. So obviously we have an issue. All right, so think about where we are right now. Within 200 miles of where we are, we have 75 different institutions that teach some form of cybersecurity. Now, I don't include online programs, but again, institutions teaching this. Now, if we think about the different educational paths that you can take, and this is brick and mortar, meaning you have in-person attendance, or you're taking it online, or you're doing a hybrid program, meaning you take it online and then you occasionally have to meet in a classroom, we have a lot of things that we can do here. So, if we look at low-end skills, mostly kind of basic technicians, there's plenty of high school programs that now are providing vocational training. There's basic certificates that you can achieve either at a community college or online, or you can get an associate's degree through a community college. For low to mid-level, obviously we have the traditional bachelor's degrees. We do have professional certificates. Once we start getting into higher skills, we have graduate certificates and then advanced degrees. And then, of course, with advanced degrees, we have that also geared towards research and education. So we have all of these different career paths or educational paths. And then, again, just within this area, 75 different institutions, not including online. So think about that together. We have this question, why is higher education failing to produce enough cybersecurity professionals? It's a good question, right? Absolutely. Well, we have some standard reasons. You know, one is interest. You can't force students into it as much as we would like to. We have basic STEM issues. I have no problem once I have young women who are coming into my classroom, getting them to look at maybe even computer science as a minor or as a double major. I have absolutely no problem sending them to coding camps, but getting them to actually take, you know, dedicated coursework alongside men is very intimidating for them. James Madison, not the most diverse university, so we also have issues with representation of minority students. You know, everybody experiences this to some level of another, and there's different variables involved. We also have attrition. People sign up, not for them, they drop out. I've had plenty of students midway through a program get a job and leave. It happens. In looking at some of these programs, I have to ask myself, they're saying that they're giving students a they're educating them in cybersecurity, but when I really look at their curriculum, there's maybe one class that's offered to them. Is that really cybersecurity? Probably not. So we have to wonder, you know, separating the wheat from the chaff, who's really teaching this topic matter? But then you can also ask, I'm sorry, we had a question?
Is that, do you think, because the computer science field is mostly like men in that field? Do you think that's partially the reason?
Again, I can't speak for all universities, but it's over 90% men at James Madison. Okay. Okay, so other reasons that this could be happening. Well, sometimes we can ask, is degree structure actually a problem? I have a computer science major who has taken 2 intelligence courses with me, one in cyber intelligence, one in social media, and I ended up basically tutoring him through a history class and also a literature class. Very bright young man. He has a very bright future ahead of him, but he really struggled with the Jane Austen that was assigned to him in his literature course, and he needs his literature course in order to get his degree. And I'm a big proponent of the liberal arts education, but it's not necessarily for everyone. Do we necessarily need, is there maybe a tipping point where maybe certain courses are a little too much for certain types of student? This is a person who is very dedicated to his studies. He's, a perfect A in his computer science courses, but when he's gone into the liberal arts courses, he has really, really struggled. So I'm wondering, is this necessarily a good thing? Do we necessarily have to have liberal arts education for certain people who are on a certain type of career trajectory? And that's a conversation worth having. And then also, I still see that there's a failure to kind of understand the space. When we're talking about cybersecurity, there's definitely the technical side, but then there's also the analytical side. Particularly in this room today, we have people who are, doing dark web analysis in political science and sociology. I do it in intelligence analysis. But who here is actually in a computer science program teaching? You are, so we've got 2. So again, we have this type of practice occurring outside the traditional discipline where some of that training is normally occurring. So briefly, to kind of talk about a difference between cybersecurity and cyber intelligence. Everybody pretty much know the difference? Yes? Yep, I got it. I got the slide. All right, cybersecurity. When we're talking about cybersecurity, it's very inward-looking. We have people who are really constantly examining internal systems for threats. It's very technical and proactive, and of course they also are reactive when we talk about things like incident response. Now, there's varying degrees of this. I know that we could probably nitpick and add, dozens of more things to this, but broadly, this is what we're talking about. When we get into cyber intelligence, though, this is really outward-looking. These are the analysts who look outside, and they are looking at the greater macro environment. What is going on in the world, and are we prepared for an attack like that? It's risk assessment. It's using TTPs, typical, structured analytical methodologies. And it's also talking about communications. These are people who are really tasked with communicating with the technical part of their organizations, but then also the decision-making part of their organizations. And as we all well know, not all of our decision makers are the most technically oriented persons. So we do have a difference between the two. So keep this in mind. I promise I'm going to pull this all together. All right, so let's go back to talking about those job listings. In looking at all of this, I went back and I took a sample, about 10%, so I was looking at 6,800 jobs. And out of that, 52% did not specify a skill level that was required. It was very vague, it was very generalized, and really didn't talk about the skill. 74% interchanged cybersecurity and cyber intelligence skills. So what they were describing was really a cyber intelligence person, or what they were describing was saying cyber intelligence, but they were really looking for a cybersecurity person. And that can be really confusing. We're finding that there's a little bit of a communication disconnect. I'm in the middle of this research, so I don't have hard numbers, but then I also found that there were many that required a degree, but when they really got specific about the skills that were required, this is something you could find in any high school educational or vocational program. So it was very low tech. But also, whoa, what did I do? Here we go. We also had required no degree, but then had very advanced skills. And then, of course, lastly, when we talked about dark web analysis, not a single one of those 6,800 jobs specified anyone looking at having any type of skill set of analyzing dark web. I'm in the middle of actually querying a lot of these companies. So again, I'm in the middle of my research, but right now I've probably contacted over 200 of these companies, and I asked, is this something that you would require of this job? And every single one of them said yes. Like, okay, why is it not in your job description? Good point. So let's bring this back to higher education. When we talk about dark web analysis in higher education, it operates in an extremely unique space right now. And I'm not sure why this is. Maybe because it's gaining traction, maybe because it's still so new. But I also like to refer to it as a black hole, and I'm sure there's plenty of academics here who would agree with this. There's many universities who are offering cybersecurity, but they're not offering cyber intelligence. We have university administration or even department administration that really has no knowledge about dark web. I mean, they really honestly, they kind of recognize the space, but they really don't know what is exactly being taught within their curriculum. They couldn't name anything. Here's this professor you might want to talk to. Admin has a little bit of knowledge, but they have a tremendous amount of fear. Eric, I'm going to be bringing into in the discussion afterwards, but I have taught at an R1 university. I have taught at a teaching college. I teach now at a comprehensive university, and all three of them would prefer that my students not be on deep web, let alone dark web, on university networks. Tremendous amount of fear. I've had multiple conversations with the lawyers, administration, insurance companies at some point, and we'll talk a little bit more about the difficulties. Many teach forensics, you know, basically how do we kind of deconstruct a cyber incident, which is a valuable skill in cybersecurity, but not really teaching investigation. So when we look at all of these students who are going into law enforcement or are going into business and, you know, looking at intellectual property protection, or we have people who are still, you know, doing media studies and about to go out into the world. We have a lot of them that are not able to go have these skills going out into the jobs. We're waiting until we're teaching them on the job. They're leaving university and getting those skills after the fact. And the problem with this is when we talk about investigation, investigation usually requires a certain amount of subject matter expertise. Where better really to teach that in a university? It's a good question. We need to develop more of these interdisciplinary skills. So we have represented political science, sociology, peace and justice studies. We've got, you know, kind of a broad swath of people who are, you know, doing dark web analysis in different areas, and everybody's bringing to it their own unique skill sets from, you know, their areas of personal research. Then we have to look at the fact that given university concerns, the majority of them do not have proper infrastructure. By this, they do not have a dedicated lab. They do not have partitioned networks, or, you know, commonly what we might refer to as an ESOC. So many of them don't have it. That takes money. Also, don't have instructors who are knowledgeable. I was looking at those 75 different institutions. I was looking at their web pages, couldn't find anything about dark web, couldn't find anything about deep web. I was going through their course catalogs. I maybe found a few that would talk about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. Many will talk about ethical hacking, but when we talk about structured courses about this unique area of the internet, not a lot of formalized courses. So of course I call them, and there are some professors who are teaching it, but it's very piecemeal. And a lot of them say to me, I'm basically risking a forgiveness rather than a permission factor here. They don't necessarily publicize it because they could get in trouble with their universities or their colleges. Yes?
So you make a couple distinctions that I don't really understand. So what's the distinction that you're drawing between the dark web and the deep web, and between computer security and computer intelligence?
Okay, well, deep web, basically, when we talk about We're more concerned with dark web analysis here for today, but the problem that we find at a higher education level, they don't even want us looking at, the real benign areas of deep web. They find that to be very problematic, mostly because they don't understand. They think that dark web and deep web are interchangeable. They're not knowledgeable, so there's a lot of fear, which means they end up putting a lot of restrictions. When we talk about cybersecurity versus cyber intelligence people, slightly technical, but again, mostly end up being like typical analysts. They end up, scanning environments. They end up being more social science oriented, socio-technical oriented, rather than being the people who are dealing with the internal systems. They end up serving as a bridge between your computer security or cybersecurity analysts and then those who are in charge of a given organization.
Thanks.
Okay. All right, where was I? Okay, so knowledgeable instructors per domain. In talking with some of these different institutions, I was directed to people who were actually doing dark web research in other areas, an English department, peace and justice, religious studies, which I found really interesting. Very few of them were actually teaching this within computer sciences. And again, just to kind of reinforce, we have students who are going out into the workforce. Everybody's telling me that they got these skills. Let's bring it back to that, that spring career fair. I like to go up to, potential employers and say, what did you think of the students? Can you give me any feedback? What are you looking for? And every single one of them, we need students who are familiar with navigating dark web and analyzing dark web. So obviously, we are now behind the curve when we talk about it from an educational perspective. And then, of course, there's also access to courses. For the few that actually offered them, a lot of them end up being, buried in computer sciences, and then it ends up being an upper level course. And then students who might be interested in it, say that you were in religious studies, you don't have access to computer science because you're not a computer science major. Yes?
Quick question in regards to what the employers are looking for. It's a very different thing if an employer has a bunch of dark web experts or deep web experts and they need more of them, or the fact that they don't have one at all and they need a newer young employee to come in and be that expert for them. Is it more the first case, the second case, or some combination of both?
I imagine it's a combination of both. Because about 50% of my students end up going into national security, although I think some of us in the room could say that national security doesn't necessarily have the requisite skill sets all the time as well. It depends, but it depends. But the communicated need is that we need these people who have these skills. And again, if we're setting up a barrier to entry because you're not a computer science major, again, it creates additional problems. So we can talk about recommendations to this, and these are just things that I have been thinking about, but what I'd like to do is when we conclude this, let's kind of go back to that original question, what really determines proficiency in this area. So for recommendations, I think we need to update and redefine the cybersecurity or cyber intelligence skills model. If you were to hire, anybody here ever have to hire someone for specifically cybersecurity? Anyone? Yeah? Okay, what do they need to know? What would you expect of them?
It depends on the role that we would be hiring them in for. So
and do you have a different skill set level?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay,
so we have skill sets from across the board. So initially we look for a cybersecurity analyst. That's usually our level 1 or a tier 1 role. And the requisite skill set there would be knowledge of information technology systems, how to network, how to troubleshoot, how to spin up and turn down systems, administer systems. From there, we can teach them what to look for from the analytical side. Level 2 is your pen tests. So your traditional hacking, where they can go forward and they can now, with the understanding that they've received from level 1, they can go through and kind of hack systems and understand the consequences of what those actions are. And then level 3 would be incident response. So now they are forensically imaging systems and they can detect what exploit someone used and build out a timeline of how an attack occurred.
Okay. Sir?
Yeah, nothing fundamental to that.
Okay, so roughly the same thing. So we have the idea of what a cybersecurity expert should know. Do you specifically reference dark web? Do you find that people coming in actually have that experience?
So I have not referenced that specifically in a job description that I've been trying to fill. I think there have been places where I've had candidates who did have that experience, but it wasn't something that we were specifically asking for.
Okay. And
yes and no.
yes and no?
No.
Okay.
I would say it's 50-50, depends on the candidate.
Okay. So, if we talk about cybersecurity, and typically with cybersecurity, now that we have kind of also the growing function of threat hunting, then it makes sense that we have people who know how to navigate this space, right? So within this, you didn't mention dark web to me, you didn't mention dark web to me, but should we redefine the skill set to say that this should be something that you are familiar with coming in the door or getting a job? Something to think about. And if we're going to say that, then does it require what kind of skills, what kind of technical skills, but then also what kind of analytical skills? And this is where we can look at domain specification, whether you're a sociologist or peace and justice or something other. We can look at education alternatives. There are plenty of high school students who have gone through these vocational trainings that, they've got something that they can build upon. And Joe, you were saying that it seems like you guys are willing to kind of train on the job? Right. So maybe thinking about, for the low-end skill set, developing apprenticeships. I've gone through and I've started kind of gathering data, and there's a few apprenticeships that I've found out there for cybersecurity, or at least cybersecurity technicians, but not a lot. And maybe this is a jumping off point, because some students, as we well know, for the academics in the room, there are some students who simply aren't going to thrive in a collegiate environment. Maybe thinking about something about the coding camp business model. Coding camps have been extremely successful. People who are doing career change or trying to encourage women to get involved in computer programming and coding. You can go to these camps and they can be funded by someone else, or you pay for the camp and then you get reimbursed by an employer once you successfully graduate. Is this something that, could be built upon? Something to consider. I think we need to promote dark web analysis as an interdisciplinary tool. I can't imagine anybody teaching media studies but not teaching dark web analysis for journalism, or peace and justice for activists, or I'm an intelligence analyst, so obviously looking at it for terrorism, or if you are in business, intellectual property protection. I can't imagine, I have a hard time actually finding certain domains where this isn't relevant, except maybe that English course for art majors. So thinking of it as an interdisciplinary tool, not solely the domain of computer sciences, maybe bringing it out of computer sciences and making it available more widely. Definitely encouraging double majors and structured minors and computer science students. So I have quite a few computer science students who take my classes, and mine are mixed methods, and they succeed on the qualitative side. They really struggle on they succeed on the quantitative side. They struggle on the qualitative side. And more importantly, I get computer science students who I make them do, a case study on a cyber incident, and being able to communicate what happened, to provide a cohesive narrative that would make sense to someone who wasn't necessarily technically oriented, is a real struggle for them. They are not asked to do public speaking in the majority of their classes. I had 2 students who didn't even know where to begin. I had to put them kind of through a boot camp. So bringing that again into the second thing that had occurred, and that was I had taken students, mostly female, to IBM Cambridge, and we participated in their X-Force Labs cyber incident response. I wasn't really quite sure how the day was going to go. We were there with Carnegie Mellon and RIT, cybersecurity students, all male, and they are, very good cybersecurity programs. Well, in lack of understanding, it was interesting in that, IBM really uses it to kind of showcase their computer programs, and they're very good. They are very, very good. But what they were trying to do was show where the tech ends and analysis needs to begin. And that was interesting. I wasn't expecting that. So all of a sudden, maybe their program isolates someone who is of particular interest, or they could take this data and they could show that the hack originated with this one particular person under these specific circumstances. Does that necessarily mean that this person is complicit? And from the computer science side, that was it. There was, it was silence. It was crickets. Couldn't really answer that. But what was great is that my students were able to jump in and say, well, no, we can have some alternative hypotheses here. Let's look at her social structure. Let's pull up data that connects her to other people here. Let's look at this. Let's look at that. You think that she's being tagged as being suspect because she came in at 6 a.m. Multiple times throughout this week. Well, let's go through her emails and see if there's anything that would account for that. And IBM definitely was not expecting that. They were trying to, basically let the crickets go and then, say you have to be able to do this. Also, they were putting students into, they were breaking the students up into teams where they were having them communicate. What exactly happened? What's considered a response that you would want to give to the media versus a response you'd want to give to your board of directors? How do we communicate this story? And again, they set it up because they know that the cybersecurity students are going to really struggle with this, but then it was really great to see that I could, put my students in here and they know how to do this. We teach them how to talk about technology. So it really drives home a point that, when we have these collaborative teams, when we have people who are more analytically oriented versus those who are more technically oriented, we have maybe a fuller, maybe not the best solution, but a fuller solution to a larger problem. And I have a lot of students who come in thinking, oh, I'm a computer science major, I'm going to take cyber intel, and it's going to be really easy. But it's a really different way of thinking. And we've found that the computer science students have really struggled. But then we've also found that the intelligence students have really benefited because now they're being, exposed to more technical-oriented information. They're getting working in these technical teams, which is something they don't necessarily get to do within the Intel program. So because we don't necessarily require that you are a double major for computer sciences or even a minor. If we want change at an industry level or at a university level, now I know Virginia Tech is working on this. I know that obviously Arizona State University is accomplishing this as well. You have to have stronger industry partnerships because typically the one thing that universities respond to is businesses coming to saying, I'd like to hire your students, but ... They need these skills. And then sometimes it's not enough for me to say, I need to be able to teach these skills. If it's someone saying, I have 10 positions I need to fill, I can't hire your students because they don't have these skills, that's a different type of pressure. And they're very responsive to that. So definitely, looking at internships, looking at helping structure content, looking at that open communication where we can constantly revise, what kind of curriculum we might need to build is really putting us dependent on industry partnerships. And it doesn't always have to be necessarily about money. I know universities always want to push the money aspect of it, but for a lot of us, who are trying to apply this, make it into an applied program, what we really need is the feedback of what's going on out there, what are you seeing, and what do we need to prepare these students for next. And then, of course, this is where we come back to, are there others? So are there other things that we're not thinking? Is there maybe ways of rethinking these? I mean, I was just kind of spitballing these one night, so are there things that we haven't considered? So basically, let's open up this forum and let's have a discussion about it.
Over there.
One of the challenges I typically see is the focus on technical. Given the quick erosion of skills, like RAND and other places I've done studies, find that threat intelligence people only really last 3 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your plan after that time is left? Because most people don't last that long being hardcore threat intelligence.
Well, you're talking about work retention, and I'm in a university, so that's very different.
I'm talking about skills retention, which is tough in a fast-moving field like cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the plan for when the skills inevitably erode? Because they always do.
I don't know. But, at that point, they're out in the workforce. So what you're talking about is an employer issue. So how do we bring universities back into the loop? Is that what you're asking?
Well, shouldn't the university help cover for that issue in the long term?
I don't know. Are you asking for us to insure the students? Like they break and then we come back and fix them?
I don't know. I think it's a bit short-sighted if you're only thinking a few years out.
I can add something there. So it's really difficult. You think of someone who studied computer science in the 80s or even in the early 2000s, and things changed so much. And I don't think that the impetus necessarily needs to be on that institution to prepare students for future technology that doesn't exist yet, but provide them with frameworks that allow them to think critically. And I think that was something that Kathleen and I were discussing before about critical thinking and analysis that you can apply that are technology agnostic.
I run into a lot of cases where the students want me to spoon feed them. I've run into this problem, I don't know how to fix it. I'm like, Google it. Figure it out. You have to have a certain amount of autodidacticism. You have to be a lifelong learner. Learning doesn't start the minute you have that degree in hand. So some of it is incumbent upon the student. Maybe they need to go back to school. Maybe they need to go back and get certifications. Was it Northern Virginia Community College has an excellent, probably one of the best certificate programs that I've seen. It's absolutely tremendous. But then when you see another community college not 25 miles away, again, they're calling it cybersecurity, and it really isn't. So again, it's hard for students to kind of suss out what is, what isn't, what skills that I need. They get that communication back, obviously, from their employers. And the employers need to help on it. The students need to be involved in it. I think the universities could be involved in it, but then again, we have to come back to having stronger industry-university partnerships.
So I was going to say, related to that, I think it's part of my job as a manager, especially when I'm dealing with junior staff, to provide some coaching and mentoring and help them really integrate into the workforce and start thinking about what their career looks like. And so when I'm hiring tech people, especially junior ones, I'm asking them, so is that skill going to be worth anything 3 years from now, right? I'm really thrilled you've got that skill today because I need it here, but I don't know that I'll need it 3 years from now. So trying to, you were talking about lifelong learning, right? Trying to encourage them that the fact that you graduated college with your bachelor's does not mean learning's over. You need to continue to invest in yourself. And I will try as a manager to invest in you in the ways that I can, but you need to own your own future too, right? And if they don't own their own future, then their skills atrophy because the programming languages they know don't matter anymore, or the platforms for forensics that they care about are no longer market leading or whatever. And if they're not willing to invest in themselves, then they see their salaries go down and they're less valuable in the market.
Yeah, I mean, even as an academic, I find there's tremendous pressure of keeping on top of the latest research.